So the US has been touring Southeast Asia. They're trying to continue this drive to recruit the nations in the region into this united front against China. This is all part of the US's ongoing and decades-long campaign of trying to encircle and contain China. And I've pointed out many times how in US documents from the 1960s, at that time, they were calling it a long-running strategy of encircling and containing China. And they identified three fronts that they were doing this along, again, in the 1960s, Japan and South Korea, India and Pakistan, and Southeast Asia. So this is Kamala Harris in the year 2021, continuing this, some might start saying fruitless, futile campaign of encircling and containing China. So this is from the Global Times. This is Chinese state media, and the headline is, Singapore draws line between being useful and being made use of. And they're talking about how the US basically came to Southeast Asia, and they're trying to coerce these nations into picking sides, joining the US, and putting pressure on China. And right here, as a quasi-ally of the US, Singapore's stance towards the US and China is telling. Singapore's channel News Asia released on Sunday an interview with the country's foreign minister who said Singapore will be useful, but we will not be made use of in its relations with both China and the US. He also said Singapore will not become one or the other's stalking horse to advance negative agendas. And so who do you think Singapore is actually really referring to? Who is pursuing a very negative agenda in the region? Who, every time they talk to nations in the region, talks about someone violating international norms and being aggressive in the South China Sea? It's not China, it's the US. The US is the one accusing China of that. And you have to understand that every single one of these countries in Southeast Asia is close to China. They do a lot of business with China. If you've ever been to Singapore, you will see how this former British colony where everyone prides themselves in being able to speak English, how they all also speak a dialect of Chinese. And there are a lot of mainland Chinese coming to Singapore for a variety of reasons. And so there is this shift taking place in Singapore, but across all of Southeast Asia. This is the reality that the US comes and injects itself into, claiming that, oh, China is this huge danger. No one in the region buys that. No one believes that, except for these opposition groups that the US sets up, funds, and directs themselves. So I thought this was interesting, but this is the Global Times. This is Chinese state media. What does the Western media say about Kamala Harris and her visit to Singapore and the Singapore and Singapore's Minister of Foreign Affairs saying this? Let's take a look. So this is their article. Harris meets with Singapore officials to begin Asia visit. There she is. And there's the Singapore's Prime Minister. And what does it say in the first paragraph? The White House on Monday announced a series of new agreements with Singapore aimed at combating cyber threats, tackling climate change, addressing the COVID-19 pandemic, and alleviating supply chain issues. The announcement coincides with Vice President Kamala Harris's visit to the region as part of the Biden administration's efforts to counter Chinese influence there. So think about what that last bit is trying to say. Singapore has a relationship with China. Southeast Asia has a relationship with China, and the US is coming there to counter those relationships, inject itself into those relationships, trying to change those relationships. Think about that. And where is it mentioned about being useful and not being made use of? Oh, did Chinese state media make that up? Or what? Oh, it's here. It's buried in the article almost toward the bottom where hopefully no one reads it. This is what the Western media loves to do. They love to bury essential information that contradicts the very narrative that they try to establish in the beginning. They like to bury that in the middle or bottom of the article. So it says Singapore Foreign Minister said in a recent interview that Singapore will be useful, but we will not be made use of in its relations with both countries, and the nation's Prime Minister previously warned the US against pursuing an aggressive approach to China. So there you have it. And this is what the US is doing, and they don't care that the very countries that they're approaching and trying to create a partnership with, they don't care that these countries don't want this partnership. They do not want this specific partnership with the US. The worst part is for the US is that they could offer balance to Southeast Asia. They could offer a way for Southeast Asia to balance their economic, military, and political ties so that they're not overly dependent on China, but they can't do that because, as you can see, the US does not make partnerships with other countries. They impose themselves on other countries, and they always do it in extremes. They do not allow a country to work with China and the US. This is out of the question. And we've seen this with Ukraine. The Ukraine, before the 2014 overthrow, US-sponsored overthrow of the government there, was working with Russia and the West. And the US found that unacceptable. They can only work with the West. So they toppled the government and they put a client regime into power that would only work with the West. And they deliberately destroyed all of Ukraine's positive, constructive ties with Russia to ensure that even if a government got into power in the future, they would have to rebuild all those ties from scratch. And that's what they're trying to do in Southeast Asia. They can't do it because governments like the current government in Singapore, even though it is very friendly with the United States, and does kind of bend over backwards for the US from time to time, even they are saying they're not interested in this anti-China campaign of the US. So what is the US to do? Milk Tea Alliance. This is supposedly a self-organized coalition of pro-democracy groups across Southeast Asia joining together and rising up. And what do they all have in common? If you dig under the surface a little, they're all funded by the US government through funding arms like the National Endowment for Democracy, and they're all extremely anti-China. So the US cannot get any of these governments to go along with this anti-China agenda, so they're creating fake opposition groups, they're funding them, directing them, they're destabilizing these countries, they're trying to get them into power so that they do have governments in the region they can work with against China. And failing that, they would be just happy to destroy these countries and deny China a partner to work with in the region. This is what they're doing. We got to keep an eye on this. I mean, I cover Thailand, Myanmar, now Malaysia pretty often. I just did a video on what was going on in Cambodia. We see the high-speed rail nearing completion in Laos, just north of Thailand. And so now this is where Singapore is weighing in on the matter. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share it. Think about subscribing. It's free to do, and it helps the channel grow. I have a new website, newatlas.report. All of my articles and videos will be on that website. There's no paywall. There never will be a paywall. If I get kicked off of YouTube, I will still be able to embed videos from other platforms on the website. So if you just bookmark the website and visit it regularly, you will always see my latest work there. Check the video description for these two articles. Compare and contrast yourself. See how different they are, but how it's basically the same story, but how China and the West presents the exact same story. There's also ways in the video description where you can help support my work. To everyone who has been helping me, either through Patreon, supporting me month to month, a one-time donation, or just liking and sharing my work, that helps so much. Thank you, and as always, thank you for watching.